morning. Is the microphone working? Good. Buenos dias. Good morning. Welcome everyone to the first plenary session of the Justice Visions Conference. After we heard great keynote speeches last night. So this plenary session is entitled Looking Back at Challenges, Opportunities and Resistance to Transitional Justice Research. And the objective of this short session is to give the opportunity to some of the Justice Visions team members to speak about their research and how some of the assumptions were challenged and how they dealt with the unexpected. I have to start with a note on time. We have 60 minutes for this panel and 1 hour is short. So I ask everyone to try to give relatively brief answers so that we can cover a good number of aspects of your research. And I have to warn the audience that we will not have a Q&A session this morning, but here is the invitation. We have a sister plenary on Friday morning. This plenary today is the Looking Back one, and then the other one is the Looking Forward plenary session with a conversation between Tina Destropper and Laura Fletcher. And my invitation to all of you is to, think about the questions you would like to ask the speakers, but unfortunately you will not be able to do so this morning. But keep your questions in mind throughout the conference, throughout the other presentations, and then on tomorrow in the other plenary, reflect on where the question may leave us for the looking forward. Where should we go next? My name is Evelyne Schmid, and I'm a professor of public international law at Lausanne University in Switzerland. And I had the very particular honor to be a member of the International Advisory Board for the Justice Visions project. And I remember when we kicked off the project in 2019, in December 2019, it was one of my last trips before the pandemic started. The German trains were on strike, just as they were on Tuesday when I traveled here to Ghent again. But apart from that constant of the German trains making travel to Belgium a bit tricky, but not impossible, gladly, much has obviously changed since 2019, as you all know. And I want to use this opportunity just to underline how absolutely impressive and productive this project has been and how much has been achieved by the researchers. When the project was kicked off, many of the PhD researchers just had a big international move completed to cope with, and then of course the pandemic was extremely disruptive for the field research of the project. And now, if we look back at how much has been done and how creative Tina and her team were to engage with the unexpected and to seize opportunities and use innovative formats in engaging sometimes in aspects that were not anticipated at the outset of the project, it's just absolutely fantastic, and I want to congratulate you all for all those achievements and invite the audience to reflect on how some of the aspects of how to run this project and what has been achieved could be used to inspire best practices in other projects. Now, I am going to introduce the 4 speakers. I will introduce them all at once, and then we will hear from your projects. So we have Gretel, Elke, Cito, and Brigitte. And I will introduce the 4 of them. Gretel is a Guatemalan lawyer, and she has done work on corruption in Latin America and law. And within the Justice Visions project, her research focuses particularly on the Guatemala case and on the involvement of indigenous voices and the Mejía trajectories to redress and justice. Then Elke Evrard is a postdoctoral researcher in Ghent. She brought a lot of methodological baggage to the project, and her PhD uses multiple methods, quantitative methods and even experimental ones, to look in a transversal way on victim participation or the different forms of agency this can take. And then Cito is a journalist, activist, and researcher now working for Search for Common Ground. And Cito has particular experience on youth involvement in peace-building processes. And within the Justice Visions project, his research focuses notably on this collective dimension of youth involvement and on the case study of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Then Brigitte Herremans is also a postdoctoral researcher, now working on the future-proofing human rights project, and her main focus is on the interaction and relation between arts and accountability in the Syrian and the Palestinian context. And I want to use this as an opportunity for publicity, because we can hear more from Brigitte tonight after the concert that no one should miss when we hear more about this interaction between arts and transitional justice. Now, our task is to look back, and one question always is how far to look back and where to start looking back. So I suggest that we just look back to last night, to the keynote speeches we heard, and that we take it from there on to see how some of the key points of departure of the project evolved over time. So one thing that really stuck with me from the keynotes yesterday was Rosalina Tuyuk's emphasis on the privilege of the academic voice. And given that all your projects are part of an ERC grant, so academic research, and the fact that you have to produce a PhD, moreover, in a short period of time, it really stuck with me the way she mentioned that the protagonists or the victims' voices were there. They were always there and they were strong, but they were not taken into account. But then when the United Nations or the universities started to pick up on the issues, the dynamic changed. And I think that really emphasizes the extent of the privilege of the academic voice, even more so in the global north, and how we deal with it. I found that really important. Also the opportunities that this creates, but of course also the huge responsibility that comes with it. Now, Tina said yesterday at the opening remarks that at the outset of the project, victims' participation in the literature is often framed as something that there's a formal process, let's say a truth commission, and then somehow someone decides that now victims are invited in those spaces and they should participate. And then there is a lot of debate and criticism about the modalities, how this participation happens, or a critique of the limitations of such participation. However, last night we got a much broader sense of different forms, maybe unexpected, multidimensional forms of agency and participation. So I would like to start with you, Gretel. If you could maybe tell us a bit more how this resonated with your research, looking back at the point of departure in the project and how this idea of participation evolved over time.
Thank you, Professor Schmid. Yes, I think one of the elements that struck me the most, especially when hearing Rosalina's story yesterday and just reflecting in the 4 years that we did this research project, is the expansion of agency of victims, right? And how sometimes in traditional transitional justice processes, when we look at victim participation, we focus on a particular formal mechanism, be it a truth commission and inclusion of victims there, or a particular criminal accountability process, a national program of reparations. So what we tried to do, in at least the Guatemalan project, and it's something that expanded throughout the whole project, is to take a step back and to go into the root, into the sustained collective action of victims, and something that Rosalina said, yes, this is a commitment for life, the participation for redress, for dignity is a commitment for life. And that is something that I'd like to, and that I attempted to do in my research as well, to trace the trajectory of participation of a particular community in the Mejía area in Guatemala, one of the first communities that experienced the massacre in the context of the scorched earth policies in the country, and to trace this trajectory from their displacement, how they got involved in solidarity movements as well, and at the same time how they started to organize themselves, to then seek redress and seek justice at different venues, of course, taking into account the importance that is to participate before the state, especially in a context in which the violence is so dehumanizing as well, and in a context of historical dispossession, historical exclusion of indigenous peoples. So the role of the state plays a crucial role, but at the same time, taking into account the sustained collective action that happens at popular spaces, grassroots spaces, in assembly meetings, community assembly meetings, victims committees as well. So for me, that's I think one of the key takeaways as well of taking this broader look at participation that led to many unexpected or outcomes, divergent outcomes as I like to call them, but we can talk about that later.
Elke, how did you make sense of this? Because from a methodological point of view, it's very easily complexifying things, right? So can you tell us more about how you theorize this reality?
Yes, certainly. So I think this spatial and also temporal complexity that Gretel is also describing in the Guatemalan context, for example, it really urged us to approach participation not from the institution-centric point of view, but to take an actor-centric point of view, where we reflect the way, or where we try to understand the way that victims themselves choose, shape, and experience their participation. It means that we sort of theorize or see this as longer trajectories unfolding throughout the different initiatives, spaces, demands that victims foreground, spaces that are available to them, but also moments and forms of agency that they create themselves. And these trajectories then unfold in a sort of transitional justice ecosystem almost. And we use this notion of trajectories and ecosystems in, I think, in nearly all of the case studies of the project, because it proved to be a valuable way of approaching the topic. And very concretely, it meant paying more attention to complex victimhood identities and to shifting interest. It meant looking at the spatial and temporal dimensions of participation, and it also meant a more open-ended way of understanding impact or change, because taking this point of view of trajectories, we really looked at how victim participants were or weren't able to really shift or change their position, their socio-political position in society, and to further their interest by transposing and taking along insights and agency between different moments and between different spaces in these these longer trajectories, in these broader trajectories. And that seems quite intuitive, I think, but it is really a departure from the typical models of participation, the ladders, the typologies that are often used, or that were often used in our fields. And I think we do see that more researchers in the field are kind of stepping away from these quite rigid typologies to consider more ecological and also more context-sensitive ways of understanding participation.
I think that the term ecosystem is really interesting and innovative in that research project, but obviously complex, because in an ecosystem, different actors have different roles and different powers, and ecosystems are by inherently complex. So I'd like to pass the microphone to Brigitte to invite you to try to explain to us concretely how in the Syrian and/or Palestinian context, how you made sense of this notion of ecosystem, what it brought to your own case study.
Thank you. I'll stick to the Syrian context because my research was focusing on that. I believe that in the Syrian case it's very interesting to adopt this ecosystemic approach, because we see, of course, that Syria is a case of an entrenched non-transition. We can debate for a very long time if this is an appropriate transitional justice case, but we see that local entrepreneurs, justice actors as we call them, together with international actors, really took hold of the transitional justice paradigm in a context which is absolutely marred by impunity, by a lack of international interest, dwindling international interest in transitional justice, and they accommodated it to the local context, and it was the sole paradigm that they could actually use in this context of a protracted accountability gap. So in that sense, we see that the transitional justice toolkit was used in a very interesting and innovative way to also push back against this accountability gap. And of course, we see that universal jurisdiction, for example, was revived internationally, but also in the Syrian context, where local Syrian and international justice actors used it to push back against state torture, of course, and we saw in Koblenz the first trial against state torture, which was a milestone. That's, of course, the typical criminal accountability proceedings. When we look at other pathways for justice, we see, of course, that artistic practices in the Syrian context are also very interesting because they complement this more typical ways of thinking about justice, and we see that justice actors, and in particular victim movements, also appropriated, accommodated the toolkit in order to ask mainly about the fate of the missing and the disappeared, which is of course one of the major crises in the Syrian context, with over 100,000 people missing and disappeared. And we see that they're often also inspired by the Latin American context. In Syria, you don't have a square to go and protest, but the square is somehow diffused in Europe. We see in Berlin, which is very open for Syrian protests, unlike a Palestinian protest. We see that justice actors really took hold of innovative practices. There's a Freedom Bus initiative, for example, with a double-decker bus by the Syria campaign, moving through Europe with pictures of the missing and the disappeared. And we see that in this way, victim groups and the victim movement that really arose because of the activism of victims allowed to put the issue of the missing and disappeared back on the international agenda. So in that sense, there's a combination of resistance and mobilization in appropriating a toolkit, which is quite atypical in this context.
Can I just maybe go back and ask a follow-up question? Did you anticipate that that kind of practices would come up when you look at victim participation in a context that we can argue whether or not it's even transitional justice? Or was this a complete surprise?
Not at all. For me, it was a complete surprise. Probably for observers in the Syrian context for a longer period, maybe it was less of a surprise, but it's only in 2016. Well, it's relatively novel because, of course, civil society activism was completely banned in Syria, and the transitional justice paradigm was only introduced in 2011 at a hopeful moment. And it's quite remarkable that we see that it was introduced in a moment where the justice initiatives were plummeting, and victim groups then really felt the urge to get organized, and I think they were also very much inspired by other contexts. So it was a surprise, and it was also surprising, and we will also talk about this later this afternoon in the panel on Syrian justice activism, that it was so powerful in the sense that victims very strongly and quickly were allowed to debate also in international avenues where normally they can, if we say it respectfully, mostly just share their stories rather than share solutions and push for solutions. So that's stunning, really.
Thank you very much. I would like to follow up on the question of these communities of practices. Because yesterday in the keynote speeches, more than one speaker spoke about the idea of doing things together. Elke Gerardo Salina said, but I think we heard similar remarks from the others as well about the interaction between the collective nature of a community of practice, where the sum of the efforts are more than the individual contributions, and that there's something bigger happening because of the fact of people doing things together. I would like to ask you, Cito, how this played out in your case study from the Eastern Congo, and how you navigated the literature on the individual and the collective dimensions, and what you made of it.
Yes, thank you very much, Evelyne, for the question. And I just would like maybe to pivot on some of the points that my colleagues have also mentioned, which I think also speak to this tension and this complementarity between individual and collective participation. So what I think is very important here to remember is what Elke mentioned, is that victims in context of ongoing violence shape their own understanding of participation. And by so doing, they navigate complexities that are often difficult to actually elucidate in literature. One of the challenges that I faced myself while examining victim participation in the transitional justice literature, it often positions the individual as the central actor. But in the context of the DRC, where we've experienced decades and decades of human rights abuses that have never been accounted for, the individual actually becomes insignificant to push for accountability. And what we've actually been noticing is through research and other movements that are working on transitional justice, the whole dimension of collective is taking preeminence, not just in the grassroots movement, but also in the public discourse on how transitional justice should take center stage in the Congo case. Now, one of the things I also want to mention is when you're looking at collective participation, I think in my case study, when I was looking at how these groups are able to foreground justice and how do they play a role in keeping accountable not only the state actors, but also bringing in awareness of the need for collective voices to be taken seriously. There are three things that collective participation does that individual participation does not do in the Congo context. So the first thing that collective participation does is this visibilization effect. And what it does by so doing, by really shaping, or at least by showing human rights abuses that have been committed by security actors. We've seen this not only in the Kamina Sample case, which is just a very recent case in 2017, where a militia group, together with some military, were able to commit human rights abuses, but through collective participation, the voices of the victims were taken seriously. And now we do have a transitional justice mechanism in the central Kasai region, which is taking shape as a result of this collective participation. Now, the other thing that collective participation does is the catalyzing effect, and what I really want to mention here is that it does show the value of working together and in complementarity with other TJ mechanisms. It's not just one area of TJ mechanism that can take forward, and in many cases we see that in the Congo case particularly, there's been an emphasis on truth and reconciliation, which failed unfortunately in 2003. There's been a lot of effort as well on criminal accountability through the ICC, which is work in progress, but collective participation shows the value of working with building efforts on other TJ mechanisms. And very lastly is the recognition effect. So what collective participation does is showing the value for the international community actually to not be silent any longer, and recognizing that millions and millions of victims need their justice needs addressed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I invite you to maybe tell the audience a bit more about whether you felt frustrated by the existing transitional justice literature? Did you find that maybe, I don't know if Paul Greedy is in the room, the notion of transformative justice would be of any use to take into account what you just said, what you found?
Yes, indeed. I really enjoyed the literature on transformative justice, and I think it really spoke to me, not only because it's looking at the systemic and the structural needs that need to be addressed for transitional justice to take shape, but particularly because it's putting and placing the premium on victims as central actors in the TJ process. But again, one thing that we know, at least in the Congo case, there's this little bit of a tension between transformative justice and a decentralized approach to transitional justice, which is really coming forward as an approach that TJ actors and experts feel can be actually maybe more suitable to the Congo case study. And also, I think it's important to look at how can we work cross-disciplinary, because transformation, I think, is not just one discipline's efforts. I think one thing that is still missing, both in the literature and also in practices, how different actors from different backgrounds, humanitarian actors, development actors, peace building actors, are all working and coordinating efforts to address justice needs and justice demands.
Thank you very much. Now I think we have increasing complexity in all aspects of what we heard of before, right? Because we have atypical situations, Congo and Syria, and we hear about agency happening by protagonists or victims in forms that were not maybe anticipated in 2019 as being participation. So I'd like to go back to Elke from a more theoretical point of view. How did you make sense of this, and what did you do about the collective individual dimensions?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I would like to pick up maybe on what Cito mentioned in the context of the DRC, but also in, I think, in each of the contexts that we studied. All these different levels, the centralized approaches, decentralized approaches, individual, collective, and so on. Sometimes in literature there tends to be a prioritization of one over the other, but I think it's not an either-or story. And within the current field, I think the missing link is typically how these different spheres and levels interact with each other. So, for example, how we think that international norms and standards and practices that are maybe imposed in more centralized and formal spaces, how those become locally meaningful, but then on the other hand as well, how decentralized and local approaches and interventions and agency, how that can also transcend this micro level to affect broader structures and systems. So this is the difficult question, and our theoretical framework in terms of thinking of ecosystems and trajectories does help us in that sense to formulate more intricate, more complex change theories. But on the other hand, from a methodological point of view, that introduces the need for quite innovative, multi-level, mixed method, even longitudinal research in order to study these dynamics. And if we consider that, I would say most research in the field still tends to be either more theoretical or based on qualitative single case study work, then we see that we do still lack the sort of evidence-based research, evidence-based results that are needed to support the ideas of the transformative justice ideals or ideas.
So I see many future research projects maybe in the making when the audience is listening. And I think we all understand why it's so difficult to have longitudinal research, etc. And just speaking from the point of view of my own discipline, most public international law scholarship is very heavily just focused on courts and individual decisions, and socio-legal research is just so much broader, but then still insufficient if I listen to you. And because, Elke, you are working at the intersection between the social psychology and political science, I would just be very interested to follow up on what you just said. If you could explain to us a bit more the experimental design you came up with for the Guatemala study.
Yes, no, definitely. I think what we tried to do in the Justice Visions project was to integrate different disciplinary and also different methodological perspectives, which wasn't always easy, particularly when working on also an ethically charged and complex issue like victim participation. In Guatemala, what we did together with my colleague Gretel, we also tried to study how the mobilization of victims and the counter-narratives that victim groups in the Guatemalan context raise against an official discourse of breaking with the past, letting go of the past, and so on, how their mobilization, how their counter-narratives potentially impacted the way that non-victimized groups, so individuals in society who have no direct experiences of the violence, how they look at transitional justice, the extent to which they support measures such as reparations, for example. It was very interesting to do that through I would say maybe a different or more complex design than is usually done. But this also raised a host of questions on what are the ethical implications of doing an experimental design in a post-conflict society, of using narratives to understand how that shapes certain ideas. Is there a danger when we expose people to certain discourses, dominant narratives, counter-narratives of replicating certain harmful practices and so on? So fortunately, we are surrounded by a great supportive team of our International Advisory Board, ethics advisor and so on, who helped us to also navigate the epistemological and ethical complexities of trying to do also quant research into a topic like victim participation.
Gretel, would you mind following up on that, and especially in particular on the indigenous voices and how they navigate these spaces in Guatemala?
Yes, I would like to maybe highlight two aspects. I think that when we, first I will explain a little bit more my methodological approach, which is rooted in a qualitative case study analysis of a particular community, and taking a look at the trajectories of participation, but at the same time the interaction between local epistemologies with a global or universal discourse on human rights, right, and transitional justice. So by taking this broader look, I was also struck by the different understandings of justice, but also how victims and collective victims, and in this case the role of the community is so important to conceptualize harm, to conceptualize grief, and at the same time how they're going to mobilize repair, and how they're going to mobilize their own notions and conceptions of repair as well. So in this case, at least in the case of the Maya community of Cocop, which is the case study I focused on, I could see the important role of the community and the collective as well in the nature of the violence they experienced, which was a massacre in the context of a scorched earth, but at the same time in foregrounding transformative notions of repair that goes more and goes beyond to understanding of material restitution or economic compensation, but goes into how are we going to transform the conditions, the historical conditions of exclusion, of dispossession, when they're claiming for land, when they're claiming for economic productive projects, which are at the heart of some of the reparations demands. So they're using these particular formal spaces to demand this, which goes in line with the destruction, the type of harm they conceptualize, and what is important for them as a community and for the development of the future generations. So this is something that was really important as well. When I had the privilege to interview them and to conduct also focus groups, the looking forward notion of how they're going to repair and how they want non-repetition to look like, right? That it doesn't mean only the improvement of the community as a whole, but also the education of state officials as well, and to raise awareness in the whole society of Guatemala about what happened. So the role of memorialization as well comes into play as how to educate society as well about what's going on in Guatemala. And the second, I think it would be how the experiences of injustice as well throughout this trajectory sometimes conflict with their own notions of what justice is, or the main tenets of Maya normativity. For example, one of the main tenets is the respect for and the value of spoken word agreements. So in this particular case, I just want to draw this example in which the state complied with a collective reparations plan, one of the first of its kind back in 2005, but it did not comply completely. You know, victims were asking for housing, for productive agricultural projects, and the state did not comply. And this really caused a really complex and consequence in the communities, and especially the frustration that the state had committed to do it and did not comply fully, which prompted them as well to seek for alliances with human rights organizations and to mobilize politically to prompt the state or to exert pressure on the state to comply. So what happened here is that they went to the Inter-American system, and this is something that I also wanted to foreground, especially on what Julissa said yesterday, as how the Inter-American system in the Latin American sphere is so important to foreground political, legal demands, and in this case of a community is to exert pressure on a state that did not comply with their commitments, right? So I would like to maybe mention these two cases when we're looking at local epistemologies as well, and working and understanding and learning from communities themselves.
Thank you very much. I think you gave us the keyword on resisting erasure and the the efforts and also the huge energy it takes to for people to resist the fact that there may be tentatives or epistemic dynamics of erasure and invisibilization of not talking about certain things, not foregrounding certain injustices or certain conceptualizations of harm that is really deeply affecting the communities. Brigitte from Syria, I know you looked into this process of invisibilization and erasure, and you also looked into some attempts to resist it, to combat it.
Yes, we did. Tina and I wrote an article in IGTJ where we developed a more fine-grained understanding on the difference between erasure and invisibilization, with invisibilization being a phenomenon where you see that violence and different forms of violence are being invisibilized, often marginalized, and where it's difficult to pinpoint an actor, a willing actor, who is responsible for the obfuscation of these crimes. Erasure, on the contrary, is a willful act of obfuscating these crimes. And when we look into the Syrian context, we see that both phenomena are active, and it's interesting to see how justice actors, victim groups try to push back against erasure and invisibilization through different forms. And when we look at the first justice avenue, which has caused the most international attention, universal jurisdiction, we see that universal jurisdiction cases against Syrian state officials, because of course we had quite a lot of universal jurisdiction cases against foreign terrorist fighters, which suits of course the Western justice idea, the idea of foreign fighters being the most responsible perpetrators for acts of violence. A lot of Syrian justice actors, of course, push back against this idea because, of course, the Assad regime is the most responsible for the majority of the crimes in Syria. And universal jurisdiction cases such as Koblenz allowed for pushing back against the erasure of these crimes and for a minimum of accountability, and that can also be debated because there's a huge debate on the effects, also the beneficial effects for victims. But it also somehow pinpointed, and that was interesting for me in the research, the phenomenon of invisibilization. For example, sexual and gender-based violence was much less obvious when it came to reports by justice actors, by Syrian organizations, because that type of violence was less documented. And that was not necessarily a willing act of not being interested in sexual and gender-based violence, but often it was also the fact that people's attention wasn't really drawn to it, or that they weren't very interested in it. And that has changed. Also because the IIIM being very interested and being very focused, the database in Geneva, let's put it this way, the IIIM being very actively documenting sexual and gender-based violence. So erasure and invisibilization are very important phenomena in the Syria context, and justice actors, even if they don't, they wouldn't see it always in these terms as we have identified it, also through artistic practices very strongly push back against this. Because of course in the European justice imagination, the way how we conceive of justice within the legal realm and also beyond the legal realm, a lot of the crimes are also thought of and debated in terms of, is it possible to document them, to prosecute them, and if not, they fall off the radar. And their arts, of course, and artistic practices have a very important role, and in my research, also through the use of focus group with Belgian readers, I looked at the way how novels can also bring these crimes back to the foreground and open the justice imagination of those readers. Ideally, they would conceive of justice and the ways to go about justice and pursue justice in a different way, in a more active way, and that wasn't always the outcome of the reader groups. Very often it was difficult for people to jump into a different life, to conceive of possibilities to pursue justice for missing sons and daughters, family members, in a way which is very different from the Belgian system. So that was also a surprising outcome, because of course we conceive of literature as creating empathy and therefore also changing the way how we think about justice. But for Syrian justice actors and artists, these kind of informal practices are also a way of shaping informal archives. And this also ties to the Palestinian question, where the idea of informal archives is very important, because the erasure of narratives has also shaped justice debate. And in Syria we also see initiatives such as the Syrian memory of the artistic memory of the Syrian Revolution, where we see that there's a huge website which stocks all the different Syrian initiatives in the artistic realm. And one of the artists, Khaled Barake, also had an installation in Mute, which was set up outside of the Koblenz court, and that was a very interesting way of showing how artistic practices with an artistic installation outside of the court in Koblenz also pointed to the fact that people continued to be muted inside the court. For example, what was very striking is that there was no Arabic translation. It's not exactly being muted, but it's the victims not being seen, not being heard, not being recognized, but also outside with crimes such as enforced disappearance falling out of the radar. And these artistic practices have been very important in pushing back against erasure and invisibilization and visibilizing victims, and also their struggle in a way which is not necessarily transformative. The transformation is not necessarily the end goal. It's not a teleological approach. It's an approach where victims cannot but resist, and therefore they apply an ecosystemic and transnational approach.
Thank you very much. That notion of invisibilization is so interesting. It connects back to some research I did in the past on economic and social rights, and how often we tend to see things just as the context of, an armed conflict or a bad situation, in quotation marks, that access to, or the disruption of housing, for instance, or livelihoods, food, etc., or educational systems is considered just as an unfortunate side effect of a generally bad situation. I'd like to go back to you, Cito, if you wish. If you think in the DRC that notion of invisibilization plays a role, if you think that the youth movements resist against such invisibilization?
Yes, I would actually agree with that assertion, because what we've seen, at least in recent history in the transitional justice discourse in the DRC, is that there's been a lot of reports that have come forward, notably the UN mapping report, which actually documented cases of human rights violation that took place for a period of 10 years. But these cases have never been addressed, and it remains a question at the core of the transitional justice discourse. If we do have evidence and documented cases, when, at what point, how much evidence do we need for transitional justice to be activated? And I think this is still a question that even youth, young people, the Lucha movement that we've been able to kind of trace their history and the work that they've been doing in preventing human rights violations have tried to bring forward. And to a large extent, in the current context, because of the shifting political priorities, we've seen before the elections that transitional justice discourse was taking kind of a center stage in the dialogue, but increasingly we're also seeing cases alluding to the current regime in place to violating human rights violations. So one of the key political opposition leader, for example, during the campaign just a few months ago was killed. And the Court of Justice just recently said that it was a suicide, but at the same time there are cases pointing to the current regime in place having orchestrated that kind of human rights violation. So what I'm really trying to point out is the challenge that working for transitional justice is going to face when you're working with actors who are in position of power, who do have an incentive in invisibilizing certain cases of human rights violations.
Thank you, Cito. I'm looking at the time. We're good on time. We have about 10 more minutes. And now I would like to open the debate to all of you and ask a question to all of you, maybe more than one. If you think about this conference as a whole, what, according to you, would be an ideal outcome for this conference? That would be one question. And then the other one is, what would you like the audience to really take away as a takeaway point from your personal contribution to the Justice Visions project? You may speak in the order you would like. You can address just one or both of the questions.
Yes, I can start. Thank you so much. I think one key takeaway as well, something that also came up from fieldwork and conducting interviews, focus groups, and observations in communities as well, is the fact that these trajectories are long, and this is what we have been talking about, right? They have to rely on sustained collective action, basically, and that requires resources, time resources, financial resources, and building alliances and networks, and that sometimes is quite costly for victims that are in remote areas that they do not speak Spanish, for example, in the case of Guatemala, no? And it requires time for them to not only file reparations claims, for example, but to seek the compliance, to travel to Guatemala City, because everything is so state-centered. And this does create, or does place a burden on the victims, on also the civil society organizations that have supported them along the way, that have provided this interdisciplinary, comprehensive accompaniment, as we call it, acompañamiento in Spanish, no? And I have observed as well, a lot of frustration, disappointment, something that Professor Moffat was saying yesterday, and the fatigue, this tiredness of participation, but at the same time, something that I want to, maybe share with the audience is and also looking back at yesterday and Rosalina's speech, is the sustained action will continue. I mean, the struggle will continue, participation in transitional justice will continue for the communities, because it's a struggle for dignity and for humanity, for visibilization. And sometimes, yes, it will continue transitional justice, or it will be expanded to other spaces, to political spaces, with another actors, private actors, donors, international actors, which I have seen in Guatemala as well, in which, yes, transitional justice is important, but the agency has expanded to other spaces that might be relevant for them in a particular moment in time. And that's something that is, for me, beautiful, and it's inspiring as well to maintain and to continue conducting research as well, and learning from the voices of the communities and their experiences too.
I think for me, and this will probably not surprise you then, but I would like to invite the audience to maybe reflect on how they navigate some of these methodological challenges in studying victim participation. Gretel spoke, for example, about the necessity to understand indigenous epistemologies and worldviews to actually really capture victim trajectories, or to understand them. I spoke to our desire to integrate, for example, experimental design as another way of being able to more rigorously assess impact or change. But the question of how do we integrate those different viewpoints, what are their implications, is a question that we haven't, I think, entirely solved yet with our project. We also saw that some of our research participants, even fellow researchers, are sometimes skeptical about, how we do research or what kind of approaches we take. So these are questions. Must research, actor-centric research into participation, mustn't it always be participatory research? Or is there a place, is there space to integrate, for example, quant methods from different fields, from different disciplines into the way we do research? What are the ethical implications? What are the implications for what we can know and what we can't know? And what does it mean for how we work together with victims, with stakeholders, and for how we try to work together in mutually beneficial ways? So these sort of questions, keep me interested and are what I hope to learn more about at the conference as well.
I think one of the points you've already alluded to is the one I was thinking about, is how do we make transitional justice relevant, particularly for victims and communities that have experienced human rights violations, rather than just being an elitist discourse that is just often detached from the needs and the realities of the victims. And that's still, for me, an important question to grapple with, even beyond the PhD, looking at the transitional justice discourse in the DRC. As you know, the current status of the UN peacekeeping mission in the DRC is actually in an exit phase. And tomorrow, actually, I'll be traveling to the DRC as part of a UN team that is looking at how to do civilian protection when the UN peacekeeping mission has left. And one of my key interests is actually looking at how do we position transitional justice more as part of this transitional phase of the UN peacekeeping mission. The other point that I would like to maybe leave with the audience as a reflection is when you're looking at transitional justice in context of ongoing violence, there's going to be a lot of trial and failures. And being willing to make those failures and accept that sometimes we don't do it right is an important part of the learning process. Thank you.
Thank you, Evelyne. There's a couple of things I would like to mention. Firstly, the importance, of course, of this transnational activism. In the Syrian case, so many people gave up on the fight for justice because of the entrenchment on transition. Now we see normalization with the Assad regime. And yet, on the 1st of April, the International Institution for the Missing Persons in Syria will be established. This is such an emotional moment for us, in a moment where Gaza is being annihilated and we often give up on hope for the value of the international justice architecture. We see this mechanism will be established, and this is solely, and I would stress solely, on the account of Syrian victim groups. I remember a mother, Mariam al-Halab, her son was disappeared by the Syrian regime. For years and years she didn't know about the fate of her son. She found out that he was tortured and murdered by the Assad regime through the use of the Kaiser archives. And she said, I want a grave to bury my son, and of course people want to know about the fate and the whereabouts of the missing. And she also, in different avenues, spoke, testified, etc. And she said, I got a lot of sympathy, but we don't want sympathy, we want action, we want visibility, we want to create or be given spaces. And then they understood, a lot of these people, that they were not going to be given spaces, so they created them. And I think for me this is the most important lesson for this conference, and personally, and also for a lot of the effort that we're doing. It's the victim movements and people affected by violence, the survivors, who are spearheading these initiatives. And it's often up to us, me as a researcher from Belgium, to see how this happens, how we can also learn from them, and how we can not look at victims' activism from this typical standardized approach, but really also allow this disruption and allow this complexity and learn from it and welcome it. And the second one, I won't be too long-winded, is of course that arts are not a nice to have, but that also in this fight for justice, in these difficult fights for justice, arts have a fundamental role to play against erasure, but also in terms of creating these informal archives and also making memorialization possible, because we see a lot of documentation with the purpose of criminal accountability, because of course what a lot of victims want is of course criminal accountability, reparation, etc. In the Syrian context, we see that a lot of documentation will not be used for criminal accountability purposes, and therefore people think of different ways of using this documentation, going differently about documentation in order to also, again, push justice efforts and also create visibilization for victims. And I think that we need to consider the arts differently, and this has been also shaping this development lately in the transitional justice field and scholarship.
Thank you very much to all of you. These statements are really beautiful takeaway points, and I think they connect well to yesterday's panel of oscillating between hope, la esperanza, and the burden and the pain that comes with the struggle for justice or transitional justice more broadly. I think if I had to give some keywords to summarize this plenary this morning, maybe one could be the unforeseen, and another one could be the multi-directional or the iteration, and just the breadth of the agency of protagonists. And what I find interesting is that looking back at 2019, when the project started, there was a lot written about whether maybe the modalities of participation were not quite right in this or that case, or then people saying maybe the whole endeavor is not promising, maybe participation as such is too limited, etc. And what we hear, and I think what the Justice Vision project really brought to the forefront, is that no matter what we believe about these things and what the literature writes, people do use transitional justice in one way or another, in unforeseen ways, and even in places where it does not look like the typical transitional justice situation. But the vocabulary and the toolbox is used in very creative ways. It's just, I would say, sad that Sally Mary is no longer with us to talk about these complex ecosystemic ways of using tools and language in various places, in so many different areas and places of the world. With that, I look at my watch and it's exactly 10 a.m. and time for coffee. And I warmly thank you, and I really invite the audience for a round of applause for the project.
Maybe quickly ask your attention for a few practical announcements still. You may or may not have noticed this, but in addition to the different breakout rooms, the chapter room, as well as the exhibition room, we also have the scenario, which is a sort of nice underground area located at that side, at that part of the courtyard. We've made that kind of a quiet space, a space where you can do some work if you want to, with some tables and some power outlets that you might need to charge your laptops and so on. For the cultural activity tonight, we will also foresee a guided walk that starts here from the Abbey at 7:30, if I remember correctly, because the cultural activity, the performance will take place in the different venues, so if you want to join that group to take that walk together, you can do so. We also remind you to have a good look at the program, preferably online, to look at the rooms where you need to be. We have to do a few last-minute shifts here and there, but in the program you'll find the most up-to-date locations for all of the sessions. Tonight's roundtable, practitioner roundtable, for example, will take place here instead of the Calefactory because of some audiovisual and technical requirements. So we'll be setting up that session here, and I think I got everything that you need to know this morning. But yeah, enjoy the day, enjoy the plenaries, and we'll see you again hopefully this evening for the roundtable and afterwards for the concert. Thank you.